Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polities Podcast. We're so happy to have you, and I'm happy to be here with Nick McAfee. Nick, good to see you.
Good to be here with you, Marc.
Nick's here to teach us about Thomas More. I'm here to receive your wisdom and learning and historical facts. And we're talking about Thomas More because we're doing an episode of Political Saints. It's a series that we want to do because there is a false dichotomy that we would like to destroy between the life of holiness and the political life. Often there's an unfortunate idea that politics is not just something that's separate to the life of holiness, but is in fact inimical to the life of holiness, when in fact, traditionally speaking, and really just actually, the life of politics is a perfection of the lay life. If you are called by God to be laity, you are called by God to politics. Now, granted, we live in a world in which that very idea of politics is made narrow, and I think it's much broader than we often think it is. But one of the ways that we can sort of crack this false binary is by looking at saints that very deliberately perfected themselves, became holy in and through the practice of politics. Thomas More, frankly, should have been the first one we started with because he's very deliberate and articulate about this. You don't have to draw much out. So that's why we're here today, and I'm really grateful for you coming down to good old Steubenville.
Yeah, good to be here. Snowing in God's own Steubenville.
God's own Steubenville. You know, March, my wife always says, it's in like a lion and out like a lamb. And we are currently, whenever we release this thing, at the lion's side of March. Now, before we begin our discussion of Thomas More, I just want to make a call to anyone who's feeling anxious, depressed, sad. You should be. The world is a terrible place, and it's getting worse every day. You are ruled by an elite who would like you to simply salivate whenever they say so as you stare at 16 different glowing screens. There is only one way out. It is New Polity Magazine. Folks, you can subscribe right now. You can have the truth written by Steubenville people, largely, on a piece of paper delivered to your house, and you can take it anywhere you want. You can destroy everything you own, keep the magazine, and go into the woods with nothing but your clothes and some excellent articles on political theology, and some jokes, too. So please, consider subscribing today, newpolity.com. Thank you.
How could you say no to that pitch?
I try my best. I don't understand it, you know? We're out there just grinding for subscriptions when I can't articulate it better than I do. But thankfully, whether you subscribe or not, still, we are large-souled, generous enough to still give you the goods here.
And even a conference opportunity, I hear.
You just want me to do all my pitches at once. This is great. This is the kind of guest I want. The guest who prompts you to do the things you're supposed to do.
Alex is in my ear.
Yes. May 29th, May 31st, New Polities Conference, Our Kind of People. It's going to be a great time. We have marvelous speakers asking the question of what constitutes a people. Why is it important to Catholic social teaching? Are we a people? Are the people who say that you're only a people if you all look the same correct, etc., etc.? The big questions. Answered at Steubenville, Ohio. Now, Thomas More. I think when people think about Thomas More, if they think about Thomas More, they think about the play A Man for All Seasons, if they've seen it. Mm-hmm. And then they think about Thomas More as the sort of prototypical Englishman, and then as a lawyer. And that's about it. Sometimes they know a little more of the details, that he is martyred, ultimately, in a confrontation with Henry VIII. And some people even know that this was largely over Henry's desire for a divorce and remarriage to be approved by the church. And that might be where it stops. But you, thankfully, know a lot more. So who is Thomas More?
Who is Thomas More? Yeah, no, certainly a great question in light of the people conference theme as well, because More was quintessentially an Englishman, and especially he calls himself not a citizen of England, but Utopia opens with he's a citizen of London. So just the notion that somehow to be a son of London, to grow up there, to serve there and nearby London, which was a place that was deeply steeped in its own political traditions, its own sense of we keep the kings outside the walls, so to speak. They had their own elections. More was a quintessential man of London as well. And I think one of the underappreciated themes in his works that I hope we can talk about is the way in which More is deeply concerned about the problem of Henry, or really any British king. The British kings, you may know, had a habit of going to war, especially war with some of their neighbors, including their neighbors across the Channel. And one of More's concerns, I mean, he's both living in a time where Henry VIII engages in multiple French expeditions that are a little costly, to say the least. One of More's preoccupations within his wider project of educating rulers, including Henry VIII, is going to be, hey, it's really hard to govern one people well. Really, really hard enough. Why are you trying to govern two or three or four? You know, Ireland, the English tend to like taking Ireland. And so one of the big immediate political consequences to More being a great son of England and of London is his sense of really the dereliction of duty in a lot of ways that England's, especially monarchs, as well as the other nobility, have given into, in part because of their infatuation with living up to, especially in Henry VIII's case, the image of Henry V, this great conqueror of France, the desire to rule multiple peoples, is something that in part comes about when you insufficiently, I think, appreciate and love and dedicate yourself to the service of the people where you're already, where you find yourself. But that's a very kind of specific particularity of More's thought. More also clearly saw himself as, clearly a servant of God, a servant of the church, a holy son of the church. And he saw himself as a father in a big way. One of the formerly underappreciated aspects about his life that I think comes through in A Man for All Seasons, but certainly is present in his letter writing, in the biographies that we have of him, the earliest biographical accounts, is that he was a really loving father. He was a pioneer in the area of educating women. His daughter Margaret was, reputed to be a great scholar. Erasmus, great friend of More's, straight up admits, hey, I was not down for the whole educating women thing until Thomas More convinced me, hey, you're just wrong about that. So that's fascinating. And just even from some of the letters we have to his children, there's a remarkable amount of tenderness of this is a guy who both has enormous amounts of earthly responsibilities outside his family.
Yes, totally.
But he's also constantly coming back to, to the importance of forming them. He'll say first for virtue, and then second in learning. And that's kind of the lesson. There's a great letter that we have of him to a tutor of his kids, William Gannell, where he straight up says, hey, I know, especially Margaret, my eldest daughter, is super right. That's great. Encourage that. But also, one of the essential aspects of education is uprooting this pride thing. And so when you're going to praise her, do that within proper bounds, but especially remember that the formation and liberal learning that you're giving her and that I want you to give her ultimately still comes second to, is she being formed to have the peace of a good conscience? Mm-hmm. And that consists especially of having a right relationship with God. Yeah. So he was a family man. He was deeply involved, I think, above and beyond the sort of normal standard of the time in his kids' education.
Yeah. I think that that aspect, the idea of a lay saint is often characterized, and we've kind of bemoaned this enough post-Vatican II. I don't think it needs to be harped on much, but lay saint is characterized kind of as a would-be monastic who overcomes the fact of his being a member of the laity, and so that his sanctity is almost judged by his ability to become as much of a monk or as one could. Yeah. What I loved about, and obviously this isn't true, actually, I think even in the Middle Ages, you have a sense that the vocation of the laity has a certain fulfillment in royalty, in a fulfillment in politics, generally speaking, that belongs to it properly. It's not just judged by its similarity to the monastic life. It's judged by its ability to use power well. And that's very specific to it. Now, in More's case, what I loved is because he's so tender with his family, because he's so obviously just excelling as a father. I look at him and think, I would like to be a dad like that. I'd like to be remembered like that. My gosh. That description of Meg, of Margaret, like clinging to his neck and kissing him on his way to the scaffold. Yeah. And the way that her action there wasn't hysterical or despairing, but was characterized by Moore and his, by Roper, as just a daughterly affection, and Moore being so happy with her affection on his way to death, and not this sort of like unhinged thing. It was just like the love that was obviously present to them. Well, it makes that call to leave. It's this troubling call in the gospel, right? That no one who does not hate his mother and father can be my disciple. Yeah. Well, you see, I think, a sort of fulfillment in the life of the saint, where it's precisely when you have, where you're ordered within the tenderness of natural affection, of family affection that God gives to you, that the sacrifice of it, when you're called to it, which he really was, he was called to, quite famously, to look at all of his love in the face and say, yes, I love my wife. Yes, I love my daughters. And yes, I'm going to leave them because we will be together in heaven. He's very reasonable about dying.
Yes.
Well, I think all of that becomes so much more profound when you realize how much he really was in love with his family. That this wasn't sometimes you can get this sense in people's life that where it's like, yeah, I'm detached from my family life. But you're like, well, is it a really big sacrifice, or are you quite happy to leave the house and quite happy to be able to, go live the real life out there? But with Moore, you can really see how the values are properly ordered, and yet he ultimately is able to say that this is not the end, that the family has a purpose, and its purpose is sanctity and virtue, which calls you out of the family.
Certainly, and it's not as though he didn't really suffer trials and sacrifices when it came to like little deaths in his family life. Like, I do think that both versions of A Man for All Seasons, right? Because actually Charlton Heston does his own. That's a lot less known. I think the story goes that he wanted to recapture more of Moore's humor and like good like charm and mirth, which very Schofield merry. Is very like amazing. Like, I love that performance. But I do think there is something to not only Moore's kind of sort of big heart, his humor, but it was a real cross, I think, that he was not understood by not only a lot of his friends, but also by his wife, his second wife, Lady Alice Moore, who, right, just to kind of recap a little bit of his story here. So he has 4 kids by his first wife, Jane or Joan, and she dies. I think they were married for 5 or 6 years. So he's got 4 little kids. He ends up adopting basically more. He takes in some other people that are raised. He raises as his own. But he immediately remarries in less than a month. He gets a dispensation from the kind of bands of marriage, and remarries so quickly that it seems like some of his friends are kind of scandalized. Mm-hmm. And there's an obvious reason to that he was a very active lawyer at the time, and so he marries a very capable household manager. It also seems very clear that he did really love her. He speaks to that in some of his poetry, which he ends up putting on his epitaph. He writes his own epitaph. We could talk about that to set the record straight right after he resigns the chancellorship and before he's taken to the Tower. But his second wife, for all the happiness that we have some indication in their marriage, did not really get him, it seems, on the question of his resistance to the king, his willingness to, one of the things about what he's initially put in the Tower, it's on kind of misprision of treason grounds, which means that the crown can take all your land, and so he loses out on some of the ongoing kind of financial avenues he had. It really is something where I think it's in Roper's account, he talks about, hey, look, whatever happens, worst comes to worst, we can at least be a merry family begging together.
He does, yeah. So that part, just to not to stall your accounting here, but I just
Lady Alice is like, no.
But it was such a beautiful line. So I realized something about myself recently, which is that with movies or literature, I don't really cry at much. But there's one point I do, and it's when someone is willing to be poor, which just sounds like so obvious, but it's like when Scrooge starts giving, like I can read the whole thing about Scrooge and be totally dry-eyed about everything, about his past love and all this. But when he's finally at that point where he's just giving money away in the street, I'm like, this is just so beautiful. Yeah. So there was something so lovely about that line, because it is more saying basically, okay, we're reduced to, I think it's got like 100 pounds a year as like a...
not a small amount.
No, but he's worried that they won't ultimately be able to have even that. So he's talking to his family, and he's saying essentially that there's like levels of living, that we might try this. And if we need less, well, there's many people who live on less. And if we need less than that, well, I know many people who live on even less than that and have a different diet. Yes. And then if worse comes to worse, like he said, then we'll be begging. And then he says specifically that we'll go from house to house and we'll sing the Salve Regina, and there'll be people who give us money to merrily. Yeah. And that idea, which obviously just carries with it the whole weight of Christian confidence. Yes. In providence and in the justice of almsgiving, the idea that if you show up, you will receive because you are of a Christian people, and that's what Christian people do. That optimism in More is totally infectious. And then you can also, it just seems so bittersweet because it's happening right before really the loss of that unity of Christendom, that law. I mean, of course, there's always sin, there's always the rejection of that idea. But the idea of your country as a place where if the worst happens, you can beg and expect to receive is a beautiful thing. It's a political achievement of Christianity coming out of, the pagan empire into hundreds of years into what we might characterize as a Merry England, right? And More seems to be someone who actually has a genuine faith in it, a faith in the people of God to provide for the people of God.
No, 100%. I think that's a great segue into like two really important points about, when we talk about More as Chancellor, that was a question I had for a while, even being steeped in his work sometimes. It's like, what does that mean to be Chancellor? And one of the key ways he was remembered, or that even that office is remembered, is precisely to do right by all members of English citizenry, rich or poor, is actually part of, I believe, part of the oath he would have taken. So much so that when Shakespeare goes along and writes a play on Henry VIII, where More is it seems a character, and he's talked about, Wolsey has this great fall in the play, Cardinal Wolsey. He's going to be succeeded by More as Chancellor, and Wolsey hopes that More will execute his new office well enough that when he dies, he'll have widows and orphans crying over him. So this notion that the Chancellor, who had this huge judicial office as judge of this court of chancery, which was a court of equity, so it had a lot of potential power to correct issues in especially the common law courts, or things where even positive law on the statute books was just was too general maybe for a specific application. There's some kind of injustice, and so an appeal to equity. More gave a lot of injunctions on that basis to relieve people from what seemed like burdensome outcomes in other courts.
In other courts, yeah. So it was like another court, like we would think of it as a sort of a further court of appeal, that if a decision had been rendered that wasn't just. Because I remember the scene in Roper's biography where other judges are angry at More for granting all these injunctions, and then he takes them out to dinner. And I think he takes them out to dinner with a list of all the injunctions that he has made. And just after feeding them, just goes through and like, well, this is why I did this one, and this is why I did this one, and this is why I did one. And if you were better judges, I wouldn't have to have done any of this.
It's one of the lessons from More. Don't criticize people on an empty stomach.
Yes.
In Utopia, right? That's one of the things. Like Utopia, people say is clearly has Plato and Platonic dialogues in mind. Has the Republic explicitly in mind. The Republic is a long dialogue where people don't seem to eat. Yeah. I don't know. I'd be hungry after a few hours of Socrates. But in Utopia, we take breaks to eat.
Wow.
In the dialogue, it's typically called the dialogue concerning heresies. Also features More as a character. Let's go in and like, have dinner. And we can talk about this again in the morning. Like there are these invitations to humane breaks that are so important if you actually want to convince someone of something and actually engage in something beyond an intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
So food, very important for Thomas More. Even Erasmus says that he wasn't a huge wine guy, but if he was at a social convention, maybe a new polity reception, and there was an expectation that he should imbibe, he would maybe have a little watered down wine, and he would just get a little bit. So he was very much he was aware of the social demands, especially as he rose. This is a great moment where Erasmus just says he wasn't picky about food, but he just loved eggs. I love that detail. Sometimes people say Erasmus is just giving this idealized depiction of what a good humanist would be.
Could you just briefly describe Erasmus's relationship and love for More? Because I think that, to me, is, at least knowing Erasmus as part of the Reformed tradition, knowing More as like ultimate papist sort of idea, suddenly like, well, what's going on here? Why does one like the other?
Yeah, well, clearly, so Erasmus, I'm trying to remember if it was 1499, he was first in England, but in those early 1500s when More is still going through, he's been through to Oxford, but he's More was someone who actually had a kind of back and forth about how much his education was kind of going to be more of a liberal art, what we would call liberal arts education. He was... one scholar told me he might have been the third person in all of England to learn Greece. So that was a Greek. That was this new opportunity. And he especially used Greek, to read the Church Fathers, as well as Lucian, and Lucian's dialogues were really influential on him. So he has this exposure to like classical learning, but his father really wants him to practice law and to learn law, as there seems to have been some tension between them on that front. But even as a lawyer, More is still very interested in forming himself more, steeping himself in the classics. So around that time, Erasmus of Rotterdam, he's visiting England. He's already engaged in these kind of friendship networks with some of More's mentors, including John Colet. Was this priest who had, some people will say he had like pre-Protestant ideas, but as far as I can tell, especially if you read his great Convocation sermon, which we have on our website, reform was on the mind of a lot of real faithful Catholics, and I think Colet was one of them. So this guy's palling around with some of More's mentors. They meet, they hit it off. One of the early things they do together is More kind of challenges him to a translating contest. Both, I believe there's a Greek component of that. So I think they both simultaneously are translating Lucian as best they can. And then More also does a kind of translating contest with, was it William Grocyn? Some of his epigram poems also More wanted to engage in translation. And that forms the basis of a friendship that's primarily united not in just we're nerds, but specifically Erasmus is someone who had this, characteristically humanist concern that to reclaim Greek and Latin learning is one of the best ways that we can hopefully promote peace in an otherwise very increasingly unstable Europe. That notion that that forming the character of princes by giving them, especially using poetry and classical forms of history, like Plutarch, like Tacitus, like Sallust, like if we give them a very rounded education that draws on the arts, that emphasizes rhetoric as a good thing, as this holistic approach to reality and not just getting what you want by like manipulating people, that was something that More was very on board with and very interested in. And so More, I believe Erasmus's Praise to Folly is dedicated to More. And then there's this ongoing, Erasmus helps him as a partner in helping getting Utopia published and getting, More had published other things in England. But that's kind of the thing that really puts him on the map in terms of now you have very bright people all over the continent who are aware of this More guy who's both kind of a public servant, right? Utopia is set in the context of a real diplomatic embassy. But here's a guy who has some really profound questions to ask, both about the state of England and other modern European political problems. But also is just really hilarious. Utopia is a hilarious work. I think that's very underappreciated is we see in Utopia a lot of More's characteristic humor and his irony. But that's a kind of fraught topic in its own right. No one knows what to make of Utopia.
Sure. To be fair, I don't, so I won't.
Okay.
I won't.
I'm overstating that, but it's heavily contested.
I would say it's one of those books that I think everyone reads too early, in the sense like you get to read some part of it in high school and you don't know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And a lot of the tradition of courtly literature it just takes diving in a little more because it's going through various conventions, I find, of both the poetry of it, but also of sort of seeming like self-abnegation and this sort of presenting yourself well that often is just like if you're just going to open a book and read it, it seems like you don't really know what to make of it. At least I found that to be the case.
Yeah.
Now, what put... Obviously, we know More because of his death, as is often the case with saints. I mean, what put him in conflict with Henry? Obviously, Henry wanted a divorce, to divorce Catherine and to marry Anne Boleyn, right?
Yeah.
Just making sure I got my...
Yeah. No, that's, yeah.
But their friendship preceded this.
Yes.
And the so much of More's defense of himself is pointing back to an actual friendship and actual favors bestowed on him by the king, trying to articulate the enmity that later seems to be coming from Henry VIII as a sort of anomaly.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Yeah. And I think it's very good to start by saying that there's this context of friendship, even if it's not kind of like quite drinking buddy friendship, like Henry had people that were that in his life. There was a friendship. More met Henry before he was actually the Prince of Wales, the next in line to the throne. And that's part of the context behind the divorce, right, as well, is that it was Henry's older brother, Arthur, who was originally betrothed to and married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess. And then Arthur dies, really surprisingly. There's questions about whether or not that marriage was consummated. Catherine will steadfastly say it wasn't. But basically, there's a dispensation granted by the Pope to make sure to clear the way for now the new heir to the throne, Henry, marrying Catherine. Mm-hmm. So that sets up, the initial ground for what will be the problem later, namely that Henry was deeply concerned that he wasn't getting a male heir from Catherine, right? Mary, his daughter, is the only child of theirs that survived to maturity. Mm-hmm. But yeah, both a concern for like, hey, it's really important to have a male heir in a time where, your dad was a guy who won the crown on the battlefield from Richard III, did not have the best claim in terms of the overall hereditary line to the throne. So you're already in a kind of somewhat shaky situation, being just, one generation removed from usurpation of sorts. But then there's also the question of just the romantic attraction to Anne Boleyn. Henry was not exactly, as I think anyone acquainted with history would know, the most faithful executor of Christian marriage. And so there's this question, Anne Boleyn, as his relationship with her intensifies, it does seem like her family gets certain kind of royal promotions, and they're embedded then in this wider, they become almost heavy parts of this political faction, putting pressure on Parliament and on the wider British apparatus for what end up becoming some of those, the break from Rome legally. But before that, there is a friendship with Henry. Henry was someone who was genuinely interested, it seems, in theological debates. He loved hosting them, having them. More would sometimes participate in them. And he very much trusted both Henry and Cardinal Wolsey, who prior to More was the Chancellor, was kind of the most important man in Henry VIII's reign for a big chunk of time. Both of them really trusted More's capacity to be an orator, to be a secretary. He was actually kind of the de facto secretary for a time. It was actually someone else, a couple of other people, and he was sort of ended up taking on that role. So there was a lot of trust in, hey, this guy's really good at both being around on like diplomatic embassies, but also just great speaker, great writer. We can trust him, even amidst all the kind of backstabbing that was going on between Wolsey and some of the other nobles who didn't like him and who ended up actually getting him tossed off. But Henry seemed to, at least from some of the conversations we have in the Roper biography, and More tells us elsewhere in at least one of his letters, that getting him into formal royal service, having him be a king's counselor with a stipend, being on the Privy Council in Henry's cabinet, right, that Henry tells him what More says is the best counsel he ever got from a prince, which was, look to God first and then to me, in terms of get your service order right. And More will tell Henry that at the end, remind him, sometimes indirectly, that you did tell me that. But why did they come in conflict? Why is it that, I mean, it's remarkable that even though Henry, as his impending separation from Catherine becomes more and more sort of obvious, it's a complete mess. The whole attempt to get a divorce, the papal legate seems to kind of just like stall for time, and they do a trial and it kind of poofs, and understandably, even if Henry were this completely sincere son of the church, you could understand why he'd be frustrated. Why, in the middle of seeking a divorce and increasingly bending the government to that, would you make your new Chancellor of England a guy who's already told you, he thinks the original marriage is probably lawful? He asked More to study the question.
Yes.
Because More initially was like, hey, I'm not sure. I'm not a theologian.
That's right. Yeah. And More actually got together with some clergymen, as I understand, and they basically did like a sort of a read-through of the fathers of the church on the question of marrying your brother's wife. Yes. And presented the results, as it were. And throughout his whole life, More always expressed his, never once seemed to make fun of the king or otherwise belittle his concern. Genuinely would say things that when you read it just once, you might think, okay, this is basically just sort of rhetoric to make it sound good. But when you read it like consistently throughout his life, saying, if I could find anything to help you in this regard, I would. Yeah. But the truth is not. Like I have to obey the truth. Yeah. Yes. Which of course is one of the great obvious concepts or foundations of Christian politics that Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was so fond of pointing out, that the subordination to the truth is what distinguishes the Christian political stance. And that this subordination to the truth is not a sort of unhappy legalism where you're just a fact finder of some sort, but it in fact presupposes for Ratzinger the idea that the truth is a person, that the truth has revealed himself, and that it's Jesus Christ, and so that there's the idea of saying to a friend, I would love to help you, I have to side with the truth on this, even if it maybe tragically can only ever appear as, well, you don't like me, or you're not doing what I want you to do. It can be deeply sincere, because you can say, I as a servant of the truth, I'm ultimately, what that means is that I am I'm loyal to a person. I'm loyal to Jesus Christ. It is that idea of putting God first and the king second. Not as like an abstract hierarchy, as it were, but like an actual devotion to a person, Christ, and then an actual devotion to a friend, but then recognizing that when you love your friends, even, you love them in Christ as members of Christ, who are ultimately beholden to the same God. So, and
More saw that like to be a good friend in the way that you're describing, to seek his actual good, and not just his apparent good in terms of what he wants. More was both very aware that Henry was the kind of person that was prone, especially like with the wars with France thing. He knew early on that was a danger, I think. He writes, among the Latin poems that are attached to the second and third editions of Utopia is this long coronation ode that is published in, I think, 1517 or 18. So it's 8 or 9 years after Henry takes the throne. But he says, hey, I wrote this back when you were crowned, and it's a celebration of that day. It's a very weird document. It's one of the places that sometimes More gets criticized for just being a flatterer. But I think it's just totally missing the point, in part because this coronation ode is laced with all these really strange things. It compares Henry to Achilles, not exactly known for being, this great paragon of peacefulness, but in some of his like lowest moments, dragging Hector's body around, for example. It compares him, it seems, there's this reference to Tiberius Caesar. That seems really strange. It's straight up in the middle of talking about how great Henry obviously is, even though he hasn't really done anything yet. Right. It talks about how great power can corrupt even the best of minds. It just kind of briefly comes up and then disappears. And especially there's this thoroughgoing sense of part of the reason he's praising the young Henry is what has he done? He started reversing some of the apparently criminal or at least oppressive aspects of his father's regime, especially some heavy extortionary kind of taxation practices. Yeah. And that's a strange thing to do, to praise a guy in part by indirectly dissing on his dad.
Right.
It actually triggers one of the harshest criticisms More ever gets in public. He has this spat with a guy, Germanus Brixius, in France. And Brixius' way of getting back at him, he writes this anti-Morris, is to say, among other things, hey, that coronation ode you wrote, it's basically treason. So all that to say, More is someone who sees the danger in Henry, I think, early.
Yeah.
This is a guy who could go in a tyrannical direction. So it's not that his friendship is naive or unaware of those dangers.
What's the line about if the king could get a castle in France with my head, then I'd lose my head?
He would not fail to go. That's
right.
a conversation he had with his son-in-law, Meg's husband, Will Roper, who we've alluded to the Roper biography. For people interested in one avenue into More's whole life, even though there are reasonable factual nitpicks you could do about the biography, it remains a real privileged treasure trove source, in part because Will Roper lived in the More household for like at least 16 years. So he really knew the guy. Yeah. And there are a lot of little anecdotes that historians have corroborated as being pretty darn down to the detail accurate. So the Roper biography, another great source. But the friendship started decently well. There was definitely a sense in which More knew there was a danger, but that danger comes to pass in its most climactic form, because More's only chancellor for a small handful of years. And when he resigns, he still resigns. He says, "Hey, health-wise, I'm not up to the task." He resigns, and he makes clear that the king, received his resignation unwillingly. But there's a lot of good evidence, especially the evidence of the Spanish ambassador at the time to England, that during the Reformation Parliament, when Henry and his ministers are increasingly seeking a path to the divorce, by way of saying the king is the head of the church in England, supreme head of the church in England. As that ramps up, there is good evidence that in some ways a behind-the-scenes way, but in some ways an open way, More was doing his best to stop that, to derail some of those efforts, and at times it really seems like some of those Reformation laws weren't going to get passed. It seems like they just barely, narrowly, through some maybe illegal things, Henry visits the House of Commons and says, everyone who's with me, you stand over there, and everyone not stand over there. Surprise! More people voted for it the next time it was, put to. I'm trying to remember what law that was up for the vote, but all that to say, it's in that context where More has actually been an active participant. The Chancellor, among other things, was supposed to be the King's speaker to the House of Lords. It's in that context More resigns. The church has now just submitted to Henry's discretion over whether or not any of its canons, any of its laws for itself. They say you have the final veto basically on any future canons. And so when the church renounces its ancient freedom, a freedom that was guaranteed in English law through Magna Carta, that's when More says enough's enough. So even though he resigns, he's still a very active danger to royal policy, in part because Henry had conscripted him, and the English bishops, specifically Bishop Tunstall, who I think was the Bishop of London at the time and was a friend of More's, had conscripted him in the fight against early forms of Lutheranism in England. So that's one of the great ironies is part of the reason More is putting his head so much in theology and in defending the church against early forms of Protestantism was actually Henry's commission to do so. And it's through that additional research that More comes to a place where even after he resigns, he's publishing works that he says is still kind of under his previous commission to do so, against some forms of Lutheranism, including, or what he would have called Lutheranism, including some of the Protestant writers that are also making the claim for royal supremacy. So he's still a dangerous guy from the royal perspective, and hence the ultimate decision to get him out of retirement.
Yeah,
into jail.
Yeah, from retirement to being retired permanently. Now, but how do you justify in his life that his resignation? Because I think there's a way to look at it that seems that at least you could read it superficially, maybe, but still. As, hey, the water's getting kind of hot, I'm out.
Yeah.
Like the path towards divorce is obviously becoming he sort of said his piece. That is to say, More has said his piece. Now the king's pressing forward anyways. So the danger now of being a public servant in opposition to the king is apparent. And so this is a sort of cutting my losses and getting out while I can move. Yeah. Which obviously, given that he's a martyr, like I don't think that. Yeah. I would hate to just say, well, that's what he wanted, but it just didn't work. But there are parts in More where you can see that, like, there is a candid, like he's just not a kind of guy who's putting it all out there, radical, screaming about what's just.
Yeah.
He's very reserved. Yeah. He's always doing everything within the context of remaining a loyal servant, of remaining a friend. And even in his retirement, it just seems like there's this parting of the ways almost. But I don't know. How do you read it? Is it purely political in that regard?
It's a great question. That was one of my early concerns when I took a grad seminar on More. I was kind of wondering, like, if you're King Henry's friend, why don't you tell him more directly to his face you're wrong? Yeah. Why aren't you? I think an especially American response is, you tweet about it, or you'd start a petition. Sure. Why not be a more visible member of hashtag the resistance kind of? And I do think that in some and there have been people who have made that critique throughout history. One initial way of answering it is to just talk about, first of all, you mentioned the description when More said he would be happy begging. That's one of the most beautiful images of his really dynamic approach to the moral and spiritual life. That is to say, within God's providential order, which for him was super abundant and amazing, we're never just called to one specific thing. And we always, through the attentiveness that love, both for God and for neighbor, brings, you always have to be open to, is this still the post I'm called to be at? So one of the best places to understand More's, especially his approach to danger and martyrdom, is to go to one of the things he wrote in the Tower. It's The Sadness of Christ is typically what it's called. It has a longer title. But in The Sadness of Christ, it's basically a commentary on Christ's time in Gethsemane. And I mean, it's amazing Lenten reading. We're coming up on Lent, so I'd recommend it in general. But one of the surprising things about it is in the middle of reflecting on Christ, prostrate on the ground, sweating blood, he has this kind of like, not full interlocutor. He doesn't have like kind of quotation marks, but he has this sort of other voice that he imagines would say, now, wait a second, Christ on the ground, like isn't that kind of demoralizing to like future Christians who should just rush happily into martyrdom? Like, come on. I mean, this is unfitting for the God-man to have sadness, weariness, trepidation in the face of death, something like that. And More goes on to unpack among the various reasons why that, misses the theological boat, so to speak, that Christ is simultaneously telling us something about his genuine humanity there, as well as, deeply, dare I say, pastorally entering into the real suffering fear of his flock, because the flock of Christ is so diverse itself, because there are so many different temperaments and so many people who would be prone to fear in the face of punishment. Christ doesn't reserve his grace, his support for just the best of us, so to speak. But rather, More says he's laying out a kind of battle code for the Christian soldier who needs to almost be swept into martyrdom, as it were. And so for More, there's this real danger then, not only in terms of denigrating the sort of condescension of Christ in the garden, but there's also this risk of presumption of, well, no, I am actually good enough to just rush into martyrdom. If I was put to the test, if I was put before the commission to give an oath to Henry's supremacy, I would know what to do. And part of More's dynamism, his view of life, the moral life, the spiritual life as a journey of ascent or regression, is even the best of us don't fully know when we wake up tomorrow, what kind of person will I be fully? We can have confidence. It's not about a paralysis in the face of, recognizing genuine growth in the spiritual life. But he's very, very concerned there to say, and I think he's saying almost to himself, be very careful if you think that you would pass the ultimate test. And so to not rush into then even worse of a crime, apostasy or, denying Christ, better to start from the plane of humility, better to take Christ's counsel. I think is very relevant to your question. When they persecute you in one town, flee to another. Like, Christ does not say fear, or even a fear for your bodily good, your family's bodily good is on More's mind. I think that's one of the main reasons that he takes the silence approach, is he's very aware that this regime could extract terrible things from his family, especially if they were seen as accessories, if they were seen as complicit in what he was doing. But More has this deep sensitivity for, fear is actually like maybe even meritorious. Like, it's actually a heroic thing to feel fear and still to choose out of love martyrdom. So it's not that it's not as though every Christian does have to be ready to die. He's very clear about that in his other Tower work. The dialogue he keeps writing dialogues, beautiful dialogue on comfort against tribulation. He has these characters that clearly, the More-like character very clearly says all Christians have to be ready to die. But the question is God calling us to that? In the dynamic cosmos, is that our particular station that we need to defend and not flee from? More realized that was ultimately his station, but he was very aware. He knew himself. He knew his own propensity for fear. He talks about that in his prison letters. And so it's only when he's convinced this is what he's called to do, not just his own plan to be a martyr, but that it's God's plan, then out of love he can submit to that. But again, it's in part, it's not my will, but
Yeah.
but yours be done. That's guiding, I think, a lot of his calculation
Yeah.
when he chooses to continue to participate with a regime that's putting him in all kinds of occasion of bad things, or to say, nope, this is the line, and I'm going to seek other ways to do the good that God's calling me to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a few incidents that strike me in this regard. One is that More lived as a penitent, or that is just to say, doing penance. At least according to Roper's biography, there's many references to him wearing a hair shirt and otherwise taking penances on himself, which of course, at some level is unremarkable. Every Christian is supposed to take on penances, but there was a extraordinary moment that Roper describes when More is in the tower and he sees monks who are going to the scaffold or to their death, and are at least apparently going there with joy, going there with at least a lack of they're not dragging their feet. We'll say that much. And he says, this is the consequence of their calling, that they have done in their particular vocation the work of purification to ready themselves for this moment. And he thanks God for his time in the tower, where he can essentially prepare to do the same, but acknowledges, but I'm not like them. Not a monastic. I am a man who has earthly attachments, right? And he's not. I don't think he's cursing them in the sense of saying like, "Oh, would that I never have had a family and daughters." No, it's obvious he loves his family, loves his daughters. But he does recognize that it, as you say, that it is the particularity of his vocation and his temperament means that he needs a different path to get to the scaffold, as it were.
Yes, no, for sure, and to see that even his preparation there is itself a kind of political act, insofar as, right, by politics we take something more broad, that the good of his community, right, even in his cell, he's both writing to another priest, Nicolas Wilson, who's in prison for also not getting the oath, but eventually will cave later. I'm struck by the two letters that we have still existing. We don't have Wilson's letter, but we can infer what he's asking. At one point, it seems like Wilson's asking, like, why are you not swearing the oath? And Moore's like, well, hey, buddy, I'm not telling anyone that. But also, don't you remember all those conversations we had about these theological questions where we read XYZ Father? He's very good about having plausible deniability in some respects. He knew those letters could have been seized and open and whatnot. But he's both trying to help a friend, and one of the other writings we have of that time is, so his daughter Margaret is the primary privileged person who could visit him in prison. She seems to take the oath, or at least we have the record that she did a kind of mental reservation that I swear to the supremacy so far as the law of God allows. And it seems like she made attempts to try to convince her dad to do something similar to get out of jail. And people debate to what extent, she just did that as a ruse so she could get access to more. I'll try to convince him, let me into jail to visit my dad. But I think that one of the beautiful things that comes out of that context is this letter that she writes to her stepsister, where she recounts a visit she has with her dad. It's sometimes called informally the Dialogue on Conscience. And it's this beautiful narrative account of her trying to convince her dad to give in. Hey, why won't you do this? All the best minds in England are doing this. All these bishops are doing this. Your friends are doing this. I'm worried they're going to abandon you. Because when Morgan enters into prison, it seems like he's just going to be in prison for life. There's no killable offense yet. And it's when he's in jail that a new act, a new form of oath is being prescribed that actually now brings real treason with him. So she's worried, Dad, that things are going to get worse. People are going to abandon you. And he gives this beautiful defense that clearly is designed for an audience beyond her immediate family. A lot of people from the very beginning in More's inner circle thought that maybe More wrote this letter, that it wasn't Margaret. My guess at this point would be, my good guess would be it was a collaboration of sorts. But it very clearly is Margaret, and it very clearly is Thomas More. And More is clearly writing to share his reasoning, and especially his willingness to pursue the good of conscience, even at the expense of his life, for an audience of people. He wants to put it out for posterity. So he's thinking politically. He's thinking about the way that he can edify and, continue developing both his family, but also I think the English public, and maybe even Henry. Again, that's what's so crazy to me, is there's a lot of indications that he still held out some hope that he could also educate the king. And what's more political, in a sense, than, at least on face value, than trying to educate a pretty interesting king.
Yeah, there is a work of mercy in the Catholic tradition that goes under the name Admonish the Sinner. And that actually has a very long medieval history that I'm more familiar with. The idea of admonition, admonitio, especially in the Carolingians, Charlemagne and his court. The gist of which is that when you have Christianity and when you have a Christian people, then a king who is over a Christian people can't really be a good king, and certainly can't even ultimately be a powerful king, an effective king, if he is not Christian. Yeah. Right? Like the pursuit of holiness, sometimes we imagine it, because we live in a culture that's not really concerned with it, as only ever oppositional, right? But it's actually relational. It's like, if you want to be a powerful king who's very effective in leadership of a Christian people, then you yourself need to be Christian. So this is obviously the context of a court like Charlemagne's or like his son's. And so there develops this tradition where anyone can admonish the ruler. And this is very unique to Christianity. Yeah. There is no such thing as admonition of Caesar, for instance, and it's actually unthinkable. There might be critique, there might be debate, but the idea that within the later Christian empire, like some nobody monk could say, because I am concerned about your soul, emperor of the world, I've got the following issues with you and your reign. And when we think about Charlemagne, the first things that get written after he dies are descriptions of him burning in purgatory for his various sins, worldliness. So there's just a very different context that isn't being inherited. The medieval context being inherited in England is that to be a king is to be a king over a Christian people as one of them. Yes. And because of that, the life of holiness is vital to the peace of your nation. It's not something that's distinct from it. And because we are all involved in the same thing, because what makes a Christian political order Christian is that everyone at the same level everyone at every level, I should say, from king to peasant, is called to the same life, the same regeneration in Christ. Then we do have a kind of, there is a kind of authority over our rulers even. Yeah. But it comes as a sort of reminder of like fraternal correction, almost saying, hey, buddy, remember we're all part of something larger than these various tasks and difficulties, and that you need to act in a certain way to be our king. It seems like More is maybe one of the last in this tradition of admonition to very thoroughly take up a life that is not, he's not conflicted about the need to, in love, tell the king that he's doing something wrong for his sake. And then but he's also in some ways, I think, like a border figure, because after that, once you get into the era of absolutism, the idea of admonition becomes lost. And instead, within the sort of absolutist monarchies, you have the idea that the king is essentially only answerable to God in a direct way, and that there's no like critique from your brother available to you. So in that way, I see more as a sort of, it just seems very brave, no doubt about it, to say, look, I'm going to continuously, in love, in friendship, say, you should not be just trying to get what you want. You should not be doing what you're doing. But even when we admire that bravery, I don't think we should imagine it as this kind of devil-may-care attitude. Well, I guess that's an ironic term. We shouldn't imagine it as this, like an idiosyncrasy of More, as if he's not doing something that really Christendom, the whole Christian tradition, enabled him to do, like gave him a context for doing. The idea that you hold up a mirror to the prince, right? You educate the prince, like the one, you're not separated from the leader. Like you have an obligation to teach him, right? Because he's one of you. He's one of, he's a Christian like you. You're receiving the Eucharist together. You're part of the same program of holiness, as it were. I think that reminding ourselves of that Hoofer in the modern age, that's just totally foreign. Yeah. I think it's good to remind ourselves that he is in that way a medieval man, like More is still a medieval man.
And I think it's also, that's a great way of, especially putting it like this is a tradition, right? This is a tradition with political implications, right? England is totally a place where there are specific legal ways in which both admonition, but also things like just, the integrity of the church and its independence has led to specific customs like its sanctuary laws, which come up very prominently in a little book, More's History of Richard III. It's amazing. He didn't publish it in his lifetime, but it ends up getting kind of copy-pasted into some of the major historical chronicles of that subsequent period. And so it's a major source for Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Richard III play. Highly recommend it as a read. But sanctuary law comes up there. And one of the other implications I think that we can see for More, which is a kind of innovation. I'm pretty sure it's the first time it ever is explicitly given voice, but it helps us, I think, as Americans, maybe reflect and refresh some of our own principles, like freedom of speech. What is it? What is it for? More is elected Speaker of Parliament in the Parliament of 1523, and he makes an explicit appeal to the king for, in the deliberations of the House of Commons, people are going to maybe make certain suggestions, say certain things that, sometimes the best policies are pitched in not the best way. And sometimes people, even the best of people in a moment of passion debate will say something that maybe could offend the crown is the main context. Yeah. But in general, he's saying, hey, if we are genuinely brothers, he doesn't use that language, but the language of friendship and Christianitas and of Christendom is all over his thought. If we're a common core, a common body of Christendom, deliberating about the good, we have to be free from punitive retribution from the crown based on things we say in deliberation, right? This is a specific political, institutional place for this kind of deliberation that not everyone can do. Thomas More is not an egalitarian. He very clearly says you want to have the pairing of words he likes to use is meet and convenient for deliberation. He thinks Parliament is that in a big way. He thinks it's in the Latin of Richard III, he says that Parliament, and the Latin seems to maybe designed for a more international audience that's less familiar with England's institutions. He says that Parliament is the supreme potestas in England, which I don't think Henry VIII believed. I don't think that was necessarily common idea at the time, but he does think that there's this genuine good in deliberation that's not only what Chancellor should do to the king, but also is something essential about the fabric of the particular English constitution. That correction, fraternal correction, is something that's baked into how they can partially rule themselves. I think it's an underappreciated aspect of his thought.
Oh, it's marvelous. And the idea that free speech has a purpose itself, I think, is a good reminder. The idea that there is Moore is always just so kind to human limitation. I think it's part of the reason why he's so adverse to tyranny, is that he always sees this, like, he's very down on kings. In some ways, generally speaking, he just thinks that they are, maybe he's just talking about his contemporaries, but they are just very tempted and often give in to imagining themselves as having no limits, whether to their particular kingdom, their particular rights, their particular duties, their particular aspirations, their lusts would be obvious as well in his case. But the idea of the idea of a place where that human frailty, the inability to speak perfectly, is recognized, accounted for, and made a part of the order of governance. Is such a marvelous and positive way of understanding free speech, as opposed to like the negative way that we tend to understand it, which is like everyone can say whatever they want, and I guess I have to not care.
Well, and you can see how also, like, you know, like what is speech for, right?
Yeah.
What is conscience for, right? That's another great, and many people have noted that that's one of the dangers of A Man for All Seasons. If you just take that on face value, right? Moore has this line where he says, "What matters is not even that I believe it, but that I believe it." Right? It's a very kind of individualistic take on conscience as, you know, a deeply held personal conviction in an individualistic way.
Sure.
Which, you know, makes some sense. I believe Robert Polt, the playwright, was at least an agnostic, if not an atheist, and so, you know, and just the world of the 1950s, 60s was amenable to Moore being this champion for individual conscience, modernly understood. Yeah. And it's not that there aren't parallels, but you know, the scholar John Guy especially points out there's something like kind of hilarious about, you know, Moore's own view of conscience with respect to especially heresy. I don't know if we want to maybe pivot to talking about that aspect of his career that's oftentimes controverted. But for Moore, conscience, a friend of mine reminded me, conscience kind of means like thinking with. So conscience is always a phenomenon that you're forming in the body of Christ, in the whole people. To the whole lay vocation thing, Moore seems to be one of the early voices talking about the church politically as not just clergy. He seems very interested in emphasizing, look, when England originally put anti-heresy laws on the book, those laws were the act of not just the king, not just the prelates, but the whole people in Parliament. The entire like multi-body church thing as one, temporal spiritual, is doing this act, this kind of singular act. Yeah. And so his view of conscience likewise was in the context of the church. So it precisely to say and to claim, as some of the early England reformers were, that, you know, either they had some, as the elect, unique insight into scriptural interpretation that didn't require or even overturned the, he likes using the word consensus, the common consensus, the thinking together of all of Christendom across these centuries, the idea that you just, you know, poof, that all goes away. He's deeply concerned that that's not actually, you know, it might be a kind of conscience, but Moore in his writings repeatedly talks about how people can frame their own conscience in different ways. That this great line in Richard III that Edward IV in the War of the Roses, in picking a queen very hastily, took counsel of his own desire. That's nice to have a counselor that's your own desire. He's very aware of people reframing their consciences to give them the output that they want. Yeah. And so for Moore, then, if you're going to, say, have a conversation about a debated issue, about a theological topic that's like sensitive, it's not that he's against all speech and all discussion about that, right? The dialogue that's sometimes called dialogue concerning heresies is set between Moore and a young Lutheran curious guy, student. And it takes place over a few days, and they talk through all kinds of issues. It's really remarkable how much deep insight Moore has into almost like if you read like Catholic apologetics in a deep way, like a lot of contemporary questions about especially like faith and works, like Moore is engaged in that in a deep way early on, front lines. in part because he sat in on a lot of the early kind of investigations that clerics would do of suspected heretics. But one thing that's striking is, this early, he writes it, gets published right before he's made Chancellor in 1529. But he gets this commission from the Bishop of London, hey, the church needs help. Specifically, we need a popular, for the people approach to untying some of these knots, theologically speaking. And so his first response to that, he gives a couple responses, but his real big guns, I think, come out in this dialogue. And it's a dialogue. It's a genuine conversation where, even though it obviously has a very clear intent to vindicate the church, and especially the English church's practices, things like pilgrimages, things like belief in miracles and prayer to the saints, even though it has, we might say, an agenda, it's very, very open to, especially in the voice of this young Lutheran curious guy, like articulating real biting criticisms of contemporary church practice. And I think it really takes seriously the best heart of the reformers' concerns at that time. And so More is someone who is, I want to say, like kind of pivoting from this question of freedom of speech, or as we think about it, could mean, freedom to, post anything you want on Facebook or Twitter, or whatnot. Like More is open to some degree of, if not a marketplace of ideas, at least the notion that these kind of conversations are worth having in a deep way, even with people you deeply disagree with. Mm-hmm. But it's precisely, and this I think is missed sometimes, the way that he participates in the English church dealing with heresy, cracking down on heresy, as it pops up in this new Lutheran form, is very much motivated, I think, especially by love, not only by the sedition concern, the sort of concern for public order, that, hey, look over at Germany, the peasants' revolt just happened, tens of thousands of people died. That could be here. Hey, the sack of Rome just happened, horrible abuses in the streets. These are more sources, and you can pick at some of the historical accuracy of some of them. But More didn't want that in England, and he was deeply concerned that the pathway from saying, God is responsible in a radical way for all the good or evil that we do, this image that God, I don't think he uses the term like predestines people to hell, but like this notion that like God is, that our will is radically not in the picture.
Yeah.
I think More's central problem is like that image of God is a horrible thing for the soul, and is going to destroy souls. And he'll cite multiple times Sirach 17:12, I think it is, that God hath given everyone commandment concerning his neighbor. I'm not exactly sure why, but when More renders it in English a couple times, he says, God hath given every man charge and cure or care over his neighbor. And so for More, his at most basic argument of, hey, why is it, when the Lutheran reformer guy says, why is it that people are being persecuted, hauled in, and maybe even there were a handful of cases of people executed for heresy, for obstinate heresy, preaching in public about against the church in England under More's chancellorship, right? This dialogue is written before that happens, but the concern is already there. And More says, look, the law in England is ordered not only to protect you if your neighbor steals your horse, but there's also an aspect in which God hath given even earthly princes some kind of cognizance. He never lays out like a systematic theory about it, but he says, how much more, right, should we also be aware of the danger, the public danger to our neighbors' souls? And I like to think about it because that's very, very hard for modern Americans to get their minds around. And I get that. I think, and More's wasn't the only view on the books. Erasmus did not think executing heretics was. It's not as though that was the only option on the table. There was already some thought within the church, especially reform-minded church, that the approach to lighting people on fire in public maybe had some real not only downsides, but also maybe was unjust. There was that thought. But I would just say this, like one way to maybe make more sense of it is like if you've ever had like a loved one who has maybe struggled with their faith, is coming back to it. What a joy it is to like talk with people who have returned to belief, but also, you want nothing more for them than to be, surrounded, supported, strengthened, like reversion, just like conversion can be you need to be strengthened, right? You need to be fed. It's not just like, boom, you're done, great. You're resilient, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Like it is a dynamic life. And so, if a very compelling, strong speaker comes in and starts talking to, a reverted loved one, actually, this confession thing that you're considering going to is actually idolatrous and evil, mm-hmm. and the opposite thing that God wants from you. Mm-hmm. If you have someone saying, hey, the sacramental means of grace are abominations, mm-hmm. In the mind of someone like Thomas More, out of love for the weak, for people who are likely to be swayed by what society's doing, I think that really is, in addition to the sedition concern, the public order concern, more things, I think we ought to take more seriously that defending the weak includes this sense of public preaching against the spiritually vulnerable, is something that his society has said temporal princes have a responsibility to safeguard and to regulate, I guess would be one way of looking at it. I think that's one beginning of an answer to the thorny question. Like some people say, More wrote Utopia. He could imagine a capacious vision of, if not benign civil religion. In the Roper biography, he entertains the possibility of religious toleration amongst, he wouldn't have called it Protestant and Catholics, right? It was all mm-hmm. Christendom being ruptured. So we have to also remember that. But he has a capacious view to even he thinks about toleration as maybe being possible one day in the future vis-a-vis Islam, which is on the warpath in especially Eastern Europe in his day. Why did this visionary in Utopia become this crazy heresy hunter later on? Something must have snapped. There was this unfortunate tradition of people, scholars in mid-20th century, who said, hey, he was just this sexually frustrated guy. Oh, wow. They do these kind of Freudian readings based on he spent some time with the Carthusians, learned some of their penitential practices, it seems. Maybe that's why he's just kind of snapped and went off the deep end. I think, and there's been a lot of good recent scholarly work that just shows, hey, the basic humanist concern for forming princes, but forming a whole society around virtue, and that includes Christian. It's a Christian project. That precisely the piece of Christendom that people like him and Erasmus wanted to preserve. Yeah. Even Erasmus saw and encountered, like he tries to have a debate with Luther, and it doesn't go well. And even Erasmus is open to, look, we got to restrain some of this before it, war erupts all over Europe. Mm-hmm. Again, we can question some of those contingent prudential decisions, historically speaking. I find
what's often very difficult for us is that we don't really believe in much. What I mean is the idea of heresy as crime strikes us as strange because we are heirs to the very modern division of church and state, body and soul, of this idea that there are spiritual things by which we essentially indicate like a realm of immaterial private opinions that are almost defined by them not mattering publicly. Yes. Like that's what we inherit. And then to degrees, through faith, through prayer, we sometimes get a little bit out of that. And we say, well, no, this actually is something that matters to my brother as much as it matters to me, and not as just two mutually held but happily agreeing private beliefs, but because we belong to each other. We belong to each other as a people, and so being of one mind together is just a description of being at peace together. And so if there is someone who deliberately makes us not of one mind, then to understand that as a public act, as a crime in the sense of something that will hurt the common good and the good to which we are all giving our lives.
Yeah.
That seems strange to us. We have to sort of undo a lot of prior assumptions in order to even arrive there. We're saying, okay, well, let me imagine really believing that people's eternal salvation is at stake and that they belong together in a community that's either moving towards God or away from him, and that this is not just true, but it's the most important thing about society. Then you can start to see, okay, at the very least you can acknowledge, I can see why there would be a debate about should we set this guy on fire for ruining all of that.
Yeah.
So now we can't even understand it as a debate. Now, again, you're right, that doesn't mean we necessarily should by any means.
Yeah.
But I think it's always important to remember that we're odd. We're the strange ones, as opposed to the several thousand years that have preceded us.
Yeah, with maybe the one exception, right? Like I think there, like More is one of the reasons he's a spiritual master. Like, and I don't say that lightly. I really do think that More, as both a political thinker, but also as a spiritual, like Sadness of Christ, especially. Why I think he's worth including there. In Sadness, he has this great point about, why is it so hard for so many of us to pray? He spends this lengthy digression on describing very humorously the different things people do when they should be praying, their posture. Some of us put cushions beneath our knees. Like, I'm immediately like convicted, But he says, why is it that we seem, it's so hard for us to focus, like when we're trying to pray, it seems so hard, even in, 1527 to focus on prayer. And he's like, at the end of the day, I feel like it's because our faith is just that weak. Like, if we actually believed that the Lord of heaven and earth was always present with us and present with us in prayer, like if we actually took that seriously, like how could we not, pray better, but also just, love him? Like, that's one of the biggest things that I would say is missed in Thomas More, both the popular narrative as well as even scholarship, is how much like genuinely loving God in a deep and also sentimental way, I mean that in the best sense, using the passions well, is like all over his work beginning to end. Early on, he does this weird translation thing of this, so Pica della Mirandola was this weird kind of intellectual, let's put it that way, who lived not too long before kind of More's rise to prominence. His first published work in English is translating into English a life of Pico. And it's a weird thing because I say translation loosely. He edits all kinds of things, adds little bits and pieces. One of the things he adds to Pico's spiritual prayers, he embellishes, it seems, the kind of tenderness of approaching God the Father. He calls him a very tender, loving Father, is something More adds to his English thing. And at the end, in some of his final prayers that we have from the Tower, he rebukes himself for having a key cold faith, like as cold as a metal key. Wow. And so really, if like I had to summarize More's Tower works, almost like one of their central things, which is a political thing in part, is he just wants to fire people's, like supercharge the like furnaces of their love for God. In part by, again, this is that humanist love for the arts and for literature by crafting their imagination well. Antony, the character in the dialogue of Comfort, says it's really hard to imagine heaven sometimes, especially if we're not steeped in a culture doing it, right? So I say that all as just a digression to say, like, yes, we are weird and we don't believe in much in certain respects. But More sees that even in the kind of partially decaying culture he's in. Sure. A lot of people who are professing things, who are enforcing laws against heretics, don't believe it either. And if you don't, you're missing the whole thing. So much of his project is about the imagination, is about storytelling. We were chatting a little bit before we started rolling about More as an actor, that he's remembered for even as a page boy in then the Chancellor's, Cardinal Morton's household, jumping in and interrupting stage plays. I love that story in part because a very similar version of it is remembered in a composite play that's apparently partially written by Shakespeare years after his death. The character of More as an adult jumps in and starts acting in a play. You do plays of sorts, right? Right. Have you ever had anyone jump in? And
jump right in. No, we tend to discourage. We're always tenuously holding on to whatever play we're doing. If someone was to jump in, my gosh. No, I got that throughout reading some of Moore's the vivacity and the humor of the guy that really seems to me could take even death in stride, and even a deep disappointment in the rupture of Christendom that he was seeing, because he really did at some level believe in the Catholic faith, and he had. It's funny listening to his ways of comforting his wife. Who comes to the tower and makes certain arguments to him about why he should just basically, come on, man, get home. Like, your whole home's waiting for you. Why are you dragging this out? And he tells her that, essentially he does this with his daughter as well. Like, we're going to be together in heaven forever. And that relativization of the earthly, by genuinely saying, I can give this up, right? And you can too, actually. I can actually call you on to suffer. I don't have to be sort of like, the family does not have to be a hostage that gets people to deny their faith, because death isn't the end. And if it's such a simple, it's what we tell our children, but it's true. And if you can actually believe it, then a new power comes into the world, namely one that can look at death and say, all right, let's make this a lesson for others. Let's die well, because I'm going to go to heaven, and I'm going to pray for you. That's the other thing that Moore says to the people that kill him, essentially, is that, look, I know right now you're going to kill me, but I want you to know when I go to heaven, I'm going to pray for you. Which is incredible. And he's not saying it as a ha-ha moment, although, there's plenty of that too. He's recognizing that their state of mind right now is one of fear. And he's saying, this isn't who you guys are. The bishops and the people around the king, they're essentially being bullied. And he recognizes that, and he says, like, I'm going to die, but I know that you guys can and are capable of a better state. So when he tells them, I'm going to be praying for you, it's also a way of liberating them, I think, from what might seem like a sort of historical necessity. It's like, well, now we have to go the full gambit of leaving the church behind, of being ruled by our fears. He kind of frames it for them as like, this is just a right now thing. From eternity, we're all going to enjoy living with each other again, and we're going to be happy together again. Be able to say that to your executioners, essentially.
And in some respect to your daughter, right? That even though you've sworn the oath, there's all kinds of fascinating irony in that the dialogue on conscience. He calls her twice Mistress Eve, come to tempt Father Adam. But even like that kind of biting humor is always, I think, intended with Meg's good, with that dynamic view that what you've done now is not the mark of, like, does not prevent God's love from reaching you. Right? The crescendo of the dialogue, which is not too long. I would very much encourage readers to find it. Maybe this would be a good point to mention. Well, maybe we can put the website in the description or something like that. But I love how the crescendo to that is like one of Meg's final arguments, because she's just, kind of in tears. She's like, but Father, like, she mentions, like, I've taken the oath, like, why can't you? Like, it's a very primal appeal, but she's worried that if he changes his mind, it'll be too late, because his friends are abandoning him, is like the main argument there. And he says, I hope it'll be, too late if I would change. But then he goes on this beautiful, illustration of the dynamism of, even if I were to play the part of Peter, he uses this acting language all over his corpus, even if I was to play Peter's part and deny Christ by taking the oath, I pray that I would still get to imitate Peter further by repenting. He gives the image of Peter's faith, before denying Christ. The first image he gives is of the sinking into the Sea of Galilee, I think. Yeah. So even if my faith were to waver, I hope Christ would reach out his hand and grab me and pull me up. And even if I imitated Peter even further, denied him, I pray that, like Peter, I could turn back. He even gives the image of, and even if I'm just like so obstinate and lost that I praise God's justice, like i.e. by going to hell, even then there's still something the divine plan. Very strange, but more as someone who he's also fascinated by the story of Achan and Joshua. Okay. He says, what? I think Achan's a great example of someone who did something terrible, who suffered the just penalty for it, and who went to heaven because he was genuinely contrite. Like this radical possibility of not putting people in a box and saying you're done.
Yeah, right.
Status of Christ laced through with comments about how Christ, the surgeon, is trying to enact surgery on Judas's heart and giving him outs to turn back. And that's a very political thing because when you're looking at yourself, especially, not just others, but yourself through that static lens of like, well, there is no conversion possibility for me. Like that is in the service of tyranny often. There's a great example in More's Richard III where Richard's main assistant, the Duke of Buckingham, we hear that he actually does think about maybe changing course and abandoning Richard. He ultimately does lead the first failed uprising against Richard. But he's in it with Richard when it's clear that Richard not only wants the throne, but he's going to kill the nephews in the tower kind of thing. And More gives this vivid depiction of how Buckingham basically is convinced by all these kind of voices around him saying, no, it's too late. Like, no one will forgive you. The princes won't forgive you. Richard would catch you, but like you're stuck.
Yeah, right.
And that serves tyranny. If we do not have a dynamic approach to again, the sort of centrality of relationship and of love for one's neighbor and for God, that gets us out of the Scylla and Charybdis of kind of presumption and despair, but especially despair serving tyranny. That's just central to what More is about throughout his life, but especially at the end, you get that dynamic approach to like, even if in my fear I give in, I pray that that's not the end. And he has this great line in some of his other works for the fully kind of obstinate. If I act like an ass, like a donkey, like I pray that God will with bit and bridle bind me, my jaws, and pull me back. Like that's the kind of full belief that he had, that, no matter what, I'm going to keep trying. And so in a certain way, if you were to sum up kind of some of his moral insights, they're like pretty simple. Love God and do the best you can is kind of like one way of summarizing like the dynamic, like what it means to love is going to be different every day, and different based on your vocation. But
but you're quite right. Also in that, and another sort of simplistic summary is never give up on anyone. And that can sound, I think, a little bit, especially in that way of phrasing it, a little eat, pray, love, I suppose. But the in particular with his relationship with Henry VIII, the idea that in Christianity, politics is not devoted to framing someone in a way that they can't escape, like as enemy. Which is, of course, the way that politics post-Reformation comes to be considered, which is within a logic where there are friends and there are enemies, and politics is basically the determination of who's who. We've mentioned a few things. Andrew's book, which is over your shoulder there, The Church Against the State, has a great article on Carl Schmitt, who makes this particular, the idea of the friend-enemy distinction as the essence of the political, which, if you look at More's life, you can kind of see a rebuke of this before it happens in some way. Well, I shouldn't say before. It's always there. It's always a possibility of interpreting politics, because I think it's a way the world really can appear to people, no doubt. But that idea of no, you never, like, where conversion is always possible, where penance is always possible, where repentance is always possible, where God can always act. Then your role as in the political order, is to never give up on the person, in the sense of to always be related to them in such a way that holds out the hope for their salvation. Yeah. And that's true not just of like the enemy, but also of the friend that you have in some way. It's just what Christ says. He says, love your enemies. He says, love your neighbor. Chesterton's quip, of course, is that these are often the same people. But there's a deeper truth in there than just saying that your neighbors are sometimes horrible. It's also the truth of just saying that for the Christian, power comes in. Power is made efficacious in that willingness to continuously love, even when love turns to suffering. Because now Henry VIII is not being converted. He is turning his back the other way. But now, by Thomas More not just putting him in that box and saying, well, he's the enemy now. Now Thomas More's suffering Henry's essentially leaving the church, suffering his apostasy, becomes a sign for the whole church of the truth. He becomes, he by always leaving the hope, always leaving a door open to conversion for someone, then I keep on wanting to say this kind of cliche that like things remain possible. Yeah. Like change remains possible. Political action remains possible. You don't have to fall into a mechanized order where it's like, well, no one can change. We can't change. Instead, it's always open to the effects of grace. The political order is always open to the effects of grace, ultimately because people like Thomas More quite literally remain open to the effects of grace.
And I think that's one of the reasons why More is, especially insofar as like different versions of like the Machiavellian criticism are kind of back in vogue, of like, Christianity detaches you from earthly concerns by just completely focusing you on heaven. It's like, actually, we were saying about the politics of the possible, like all kinds of doors are opened up if, especially, you're willing to endure certain things that you might not otherwise for, especially if you feel like you have an open-ended kind of commission from God to serve, let's say, your land, your people, your family. You should always, therefore, have this again, superheated motivation to be exploring the possible. But also it really is another, I think More's a great source for reminding us that, one of the appeals of Machiavelli, I think, is especially his association with like, to do the difficult thing is really attractive, to be the guy who is willing to do evil, right? Sometimes, not always, sometimes. That has a kind of attraction, especially insofar as it can appear as a kind of almost courage or a kind of strength. And I think one of the coolest things about Status of Christ is when More describes like the lofty peak of heroic virtue that he says the apostles are slowly through Gethsemane kind of being eventually formed for, such that they themselves can be martyrs. That involves the whole Malchus incident, the restraint of Peter in cutting off the high priest's servant's ear. And More says that, that kind of heroic virtue is its peak looks like, it's almost crazy that we can imagine not even taking pleasure in revenge. And so actually, in a certain way, More is reminding us the most difficult thing is to love without recourse to vengeance. And sometimes political possibility forecloses, beating the enemy in a just war, or restraining the attacker, even though you have a legitimate claim to self. Sometimes you fail, and people ask sometimes, well, didn't More just fail? And there's a simple way of saying, well, of course he laid out this legacy for, eventually a kind of restoration of rule of law, and he was a great icon of resistance for people who continued to struggle heroically. Amazing other English saints that are worth talking about who I think benefited from what he did. And yet, in another sense, it's true that in the eyes of the world, More was a failure, but that openness that he shows us to, what he did was really difficult, was not something he knew he would be able to do. That he was worried about caving. That he was a human being who also recognized that was sometimes part of the commission. That Christ himself, again in the garden, shows us that somehow there's this mysterious God who's willing to also enter into the difficult thing, and without sin, to feel the full effects of human trembling in the face of death. A marvelous motivation doing heroic, difficult things, including in the political life. I think there's a reason why, well, that's another topic, but we could talk about his possible influence on Shakespeare, because I think Shakespeare, in his own weird way, also presents us with some of those images of doing the difficult thing because you're motivated by a kind of supernatural love.
Yeah. Well, if people, thank you, Nick. This has been really marvelous. I think that in some ways, because he's such a explicit political actor in the sense of he's member of the Privy Council, that he can kind of go missed for that as being being too obvious in some ways. But in fact, he embodies the whole Christian paradox that in weakness there is strength, that in loving to the end there is real power, and
that sometimes you got to make your decisions, both form your conscience collectively in the body of Christ, but sometimes the visible body might abandon you just because all the bishops are saying give in. Sometimes you have to. No,
I did like when he in Roper's biography defends himself as being a part of the majority if you take into account all of the dead people in the church as well,
who are also living.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, Christianity changes the political game, where even the one who seems to be standing up as like the individual for his conscience is defending himself on the basis of continuity with a body, of belonging to a body. So they're not around, you can't see them, but he's not a lonely guy who's got like a deep conviction. Yeah, he's a man of the church. Yeah, it's just that the church, the church is it's not just the people who are around. Thank goodness. Well, Nick, if people want to read Thomas More, if they want to read more, where do they go?
So the Center for Thomas More Studies has a lot of really great, including a lot of free resources at thomasmorestudies.org. So hopefully we can put that link in the description. But if you're especially interested in some physical copies of things, so we've not only commissioned individual things of More's works. So I have with me our little Utopia. This is completely for free online as well in PDF form. Awesome. With some notes. We're doing something similar for his Richard III right now. But you got a host of resources there. We're also increasingly putting out. It's going to be 10-year countdown for us to the 500th year anniversary of More's execution. Chesterton said More would be even more relevant 100 years from 1929 is when he said that. So this is the time to be a reader and a lover of More. We're going to be doing a little masterclass series. One of my bosses, Dr. Stephen Smith, up at Hillsdale College, is. I think I'm allowed to announce this for the first time in public. We'll have this masterclass, Introduction to Thomas More's Life, that'll be available online. Lots of exciting things happening there. Also worth checking out. If you want to read more seriously, consider also copies that we have this really cool Thomas More source book, as well as if you want to go the deepest dives. I have with me the tome, the essential works of Thomas More. Is
awesome.
The real banger.
That's
huge.
You
might say.
That's
so.
Definitely way down your bag.
Yeah.
That's marvelous. And what about yourself? What are you working on?
Yeah. So I'm going to be involved in the Richard III project when it comes out, helping some editing there. But you can also, if I teased a little bit the sort of More Shakespeare connection. So More is my second area of study. I have a book on Shakespeare's politics, his virtue politics in the late plays, out with Lexington last year. It's called Political Wisdom in Late Shakespeare.
Very cool.
A way out of the wreck. That language is taken from Cardinal Wolsey in the Henry VIII play. Mm-hmm. Totally wild play. I think Shakespeare was on to Henry VIII and his trickiness, let's put it that way. But if you're interested in the legacy of virtue politics as it takes place dramatically in Shakespeare, there's some fun things there. But,
very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Nick, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Marc. It was a fun time.
And we'll just ask St. Thomas More to pray for us.
Amen to that.
All right.
Amen to that.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you again soon.